YouTube channel. my movies aren't that popular. I guess I'm competing against some other pretty cool stuff on YouTube. But you know, those resources are always there for you guys. You know, it's also going to serve me in the future. I mean, I don't mind doing it because it'll be a good way for me to showcase stuff. Yeah.
Do you know if you get on the Netflix thing by that?
Oh yeah? Well, keep clicking. Yeah, check it out. Check out my station. It is public. It's out there.
Can you get ad revenue off of those?
You know, there is a section that where YouTube asks you, do you want to monetize this? And I click no. I don't. Because it's for you guys, right? I don't want you to have to, you know, deal with these ads popping up as you're trying to watch the video. I apologize. I was a total step behind. I'm surprised no one mentioned it. We want to use our pens again. So let's go through that process of getting our pens out. That's why this was a multi-day assignment. Yeah.
We have to give you something again?
Unfortunately, yeah, you do. Camera back up. And but basically, we should all be at a spot similar to this, where we've got a background layer. Again, that sketch layer that we showed, that we did, and it demonstrates how to apply
Do you have to unlock our layers?
Yeah, once we get working, we will unlock our layers, but we're going to add a few more layers just to kind of complete the illustration. But basically, what we have is the, and then of course we had our lines layer. Just a reminder, and I'm sure everyone did this, but we ended up applying a transparency effect to this entire sketch layer. Does everyone remember that process? Really handy feature to know about, and that's one way that you can apply one of those transparency effects to every single object and layer. Because keep in mind, some of you guys have already worked on some very complex artwork, and even a single layer, right, might contain a lot of objects. And to go in and try to apply a transparency to every single one of those objects could be you know, pretty time-consuming. So this feature of applying a transparency effect to an entire layer is pretty handy. Okay.
Can you do a quick refresher on that? Because I kind of forgot what the steps involved in it were.
Sure. Yeah, I can do a quick refresher. Basically, I need to start by unlocking the layer, of course. So I'm going to click on the lock to unlock my sketch layer. The reason it looks different, it has the italicized text here, and this icon is slightly different for the visibility column, is because this is a template layer. But you can still apply those same effects. And in order to get to that effect, what you need to start with is you have to click on the meatball, right, itself to engage that entire, you know, what we're about to do is going to affect that entire layer. And you can see if I roll out that layer, the image has been selected as part of this, because it's part of the layer. And any other objects that were inside of this layer would also have this blue square. Because when I click on that meatball for the entire layer, it selects everything within that layer. Okay? So now that I've selected this entire layer, I can go into the transparency mode, the transparency panel, excuse me, and you'll see that that multiply has still been applied here. And that's all it was. It was just the transparency effect being applied to that entire layer. That's what that was. If I were to change this back to normal, it would be a, you know, solid filled. You couldn't see that. You can't see that background anymore because the white of my scan is blocking that background layer that's located, you know, back here. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that was everything I had to know.
Okay. Any other questions at this stage?
Can I get the lights?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Go ahead and kill the lights now that we're kicking off the lesson. Thanks, Alicia. Okay, so here we are at Winnie, and we still have a few things that we can refine on Winnie's face, even, right? We can add some highlights. We can fill his mouth up, of course, and there are, you know, different methods that we can do this. Simply, I'm just going to draw some shapes to fill the color back here on his in his nose. So, for instance, I want to add a little bit of white to that highlight because obviously that's what we would see in a reflection. We wouldn't necessarily see that yellow that appears, which is his background skin. So, in order to do that, behind my lines layer. You notice I'm on the sketch layer now, which is a good place to be. But behind my lines layer, I'm going to add a details layer. Okay, so I've clicked on my sketch layer, and then I'm going to go down here to the Create New Layer button in my Layers panel, and by clicking on that button, it brings up automatically a new layer. I can double click that to change the name, and I'm going to add the title, Details, all lowercase again there. It's just one of my techniques. So now that we've done that, it's a good idea to go ahead and lock the lines layer. And as a matter of fact, we might want to lock the backgrounds layer. And the reason for this, and this is why working layers can come in handy, if we were to zoom into this shape here and start working on something with great detail and our background layer was not locked, we might inadvertently, grab and move our background and not even know it. It might, that's locked, okay. As a matter of fact, I think I am moving it, and I don't even know I'm moving it because, let's see, I think it's actually locked here. Why isn't there? Now it's selected, okay. All right. There we go. I've selected the edges. It'd be easy to move my background around without even knowing it because the color is the same, right? I mean, I can't tell that background is moving. I'm pushing my arrows around. And then if I zoom out, I realize, oh, crud, I was actually moving my background. So that's just one of the reasons that it's helpful to work using backgrounds so that you don't inadvertently make changes to a layer or objects that you don't want to move. Right now I'm just hitting Command-Z several times to undo all of, there we go. Whoops, I went one too many times. Let me get right back to where you guys probably are. Oh boy, I got a little too happy with the undos. Let me get back over there. Where's that layer? One more. No, almost there. Meatball, and there we are. All right, back to the detail. This is probably where you guys are at. So I'm going to go ahead and lock my lines layer. I'm going to lock the background layer. And a really quick way to fill this with white, right? I could certainly use a shape to do that, or I could quickly draw some sort of shape. In this case, I'm going to use the blob brush tool, which we explored around with on Thursday. So to ensure that I'm drawing it on my details layer, I'm going to click on the details layer, and I am going to change my color to draw with white. And to do that, because we're using a brush tool, I want the white color to be on the stroke and my my fill color to be none. So I'm going to fill it with none, and I'm going to choose white for my stroke color. And
How would you do that versus having to fill white and the stroke?
Either way will work. Let's go ahead and try it, right? So I've now filled this with white, and I click on the blob brush tool, and as soon as I start drawing, Illustrator's smart enough to pick up the fact that we've drawn this object with white in here, and it's its stroke has been created with a white stroke. Let's try the other way. I'm going to switch colors. I'm going to fill it with white, and you guys see how I did that? Oh yes, Robin.
My pen. Oh, I'm using the wrong end.
Yeah, don't use the eraser. You're going to start making stuff disappear.
How do you do that again? I was trying to get my pen to work.
So what I did to quickly switch the colors, I had the stroke as a fill, and then I had the stroke as white, and I had the fill as none. What I wanted to do to demonstrate what Craig was asking about is why not do the opposite? Because it's a shape that ends up coming out of this. Why not use a fill instead? And in order to do that switch, I did the Shift X command. And I think I demonstrated this on Tuesday of last week, but hitting Shift X will toggle the colors that are presented in your fill and stroke options. So you see now I'm on the fill being white and the stroke being none. If I hold down Shift and hit the X key, you'll notice that that swaps. Now the stroke is white and the fill is none. So that's just a quick keyboard command for making that edit. And yes, Christian.
So with the blob brush, so it makes objects based on the weird shapes you draw, right?
Exactly.
Can you make it so that that shape then has a line from drawing it, or would I have to click it and then give it a stroke?
You would have to click it and then give it a stroke. Yeah. So now I'll go ahead and draw this shape with my fill being the option. And notice that when I click on it, it still behaves in much the same way. So either option is fine. And in lesson 11, you're gonna learn a little bit more about the fact that fill is really the attribute that gets applied by default to your shapes drawn with the blob brush. So for a more in-depth explanation, you'll learn about that in the lesson. But what I wanted to show you here is that even if you're drawing with the stroke applied to your blob brush, it's going to convert it over to a fill. So it doesn't really matter in this case. At least not with the blob brush tool. So you can see that now I have a white highlight on Winnie's nose, and all I did to get there was I drew those details on a layer that was underneath my lines layer. If I turn off my lines layer, you will see my complete blobs that I had created underneath there. I'm going to switch over to outline view and show you, I think this is what you were asking about here, Christian, is, whatever shape you define when you start drawing with your blob brush is what you're going to end up with the actual shapes that get drawn. To change those parameters, you can double click on the blob brush tool. That brings up the options dialog box, and you can make changes. You can even adjust the angle for a more calligraphic kind of brush stroke. There's additional features and options that you can do to adjust the way your blob brush tool looks and works. Any questions on that so far? Making sense there? All right, I'm going to turn my lines back on so you can kind of see what's going on here. Now, I also want to fill, we have a little tongue here, right, that Winnie the Pooh has. Obviously, his tongue should probably be red. So for this, because it's a unique shape, I'm still going to work on this details layer so that it's behind the lines that I've drawn. But in this case, I'm going to, do something with using my pen tool in order to get a more definitive shape. Because you can kind of see that we've got a curved area here, but in order to sit behind this line, I want to draw a somewhat precise line back here. And again, I always try to draw closed shapes whenever possible. So I'm going to start at this point, draw a curve here, and continue on and then close it when I get back over to the other side. And I'm going to do that with the pen tool. So I've selected my pen tool, and you can see the pen tool itself has the little asterisk or the star next to it to indicate that it's going to start a brand new path. And I'm going to zoom in just a little bit to get that. And again, the keyboard shortcut for zoom is Command Space. So I'm going to do that, zoom in here. And now I'm going to start my drawing process, kind of following. And notice that I'm starting inside of my black line because I want this shape of Winnie's tongue to be completely behind these lines that I've drawn. And I started by clicking and dragging the handle out so that I could start this curve that I know I'm going to make. And with that, I can jump all the way to the other side and then click and drag a handle out here in order to continue that curve. And notice it's still filling with white, and that's okay. I can always change the color afterward. Now this is where I love working with this pen tool and demonstrating it to you guys, because I know this is where the pen tool can start to get tricky. How do I get this handle to start heading back the other direction? Well, there's a couple of things I can do. Number one, I can click on the anchor point itself, and sometimes with the pen tool it's a little harder to do that. This is where the pen tool, and when I click and drag holding the Option key, you notice that I can now manipulate the direction of that handle and continue moving in a different direction. So now I've started the curve I'm going to start the curve by drawing a handle that is moving towards the direction I want the curve to go. And to close this off, I'm going to again hold down the Option key while I close this shape off. And what that's going to do, it's going to preserve my original handle, and it's not going to try to manipulate that first handle that I drew. And I can sort of click and drag, and notice the direction I'm having to pull to get that handle to draw the curve in the opposite direction. The more I pull away from it, the more pronounced that curve is. But I want it to sit behind my line, so once I'm happy, I just let go of both the Option key and the mouse simultaneously to get that. So seemingly relatively simple shape, but using the pen tool to do this can get a little tricky if you're not careful about holding the Option key down to convert those anchor points so that you can change the direction of those handles. So now I can go to my swatches panel. While that's selected, notice my shape is still selected, and it needs to be selected for the color change to happen. I click on swatches, and I can just fill this with the default red. Oops, notice what happened there. I didn't double check to make sure I was filling and not stroking this object. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to switch to my fill by simply hitting the X key. You can also click on this button here to bring the fill to the foreground, but just hitting the X key will bring it to the foreground, and now I can fill that with red, and it'll give me what looks more like Winnie the Pooh's tongue back there. Okay. Any questions on that process so far? Now we're starting to look like a cute little Winnie here, with his highlight on his nose and of course his tongue, and we've got that going on. So I want you guys to go ahead and jump into the next phase on your own using the pen tool, if you will, and some of the techniques the technique that I just demonstrated. Using the pen tool, try to fill the background of his mouth. Now keep in mind, I probably should have done the background of his mouth first, and then the tongue on top of it, because obviously as soon as I start drawing a shape right now, it's going to want to cover that tongue up, because I'm going to stay in the details layer. I'm not going to leave that layer to create another mouth background layer. That would probably be a little more detail than I need in my layers panel. So I'm just going to start by drawing this shape back here, and again I'm just using my pen tool to create a curve. This time I'm actually going to draw an anchor point in the center, just because this is such a big long curve, and I'm drawing, I'm not worried about covering up that tongue, because I can always manipulate my objects back after I've drawn them. And here's where I'm going to convert an anchor point to send that handle in a different direction, and I'm going to continue my curve here. Notice I'm clicking and dragging to create my handles so that I can do them all in one kind of swoop as I go, and I'm holding the Option key as I close this out to draw my final handle. And I'm happy with the fact that I ended up with something that's pretty much inside of my lines, and did that relatively quickly using the pen tool. It's never too, at this stage, it's always a good practice to get into using the pen tool as much as possible. Now notice I've switched over my selection tool, not the direct selection tool, because I want to click on this entire object. Make sure the whole thing is selected, not just one anchor point or one line segment. I want to make sure that the whole thing is selected because I'm going to cut this shape and paste it in back of the tongue. But before I do that, I'm going to actually apply a color to it. I'm not going to go full black. I'm going to go with this 90% gray, which is next to the black icon. If I hover over it, you'll see it's 100% black. And the next one over is 90% black. So Illustrator by default has given us this nice 10% grayscale swatch set here. So I'm going to click on that 90% gray one, and after I fill my shape with that gray, I'm going to cut it and then paste it in back of Winnie's tongue by actually clicking on the tongue itself and then using the Command B keyboard shortcut, and that will paste that lighter gray mouth in the background there. And that gray might not be the right one. I notice it's a little light. Maybe it should be black, but I do want something to be slightly different than those line strokes. So here's where you can go into your color slider, your color panel itself. And by showing options, you'll see that, did you guys see that? I clicked on the menu button to show the options, and that brought up more granular control over my grays, and my object is still selected, and I can change this to say 95, 97, somewhere in there, and you'll notice it's pretty dark, but it's not as dark as my lines, so there's a little bit of added depth and dimension. Even though it's subtle, you might not even be able to see it on the screen here. Well, you kind of can. You can see how this is just slightly lighter than these lines, and it just adds an extra layer of detail to the illustrations. Any questions on that? We're repeating some of the steps here. Any questions on what we just covered there? Going well? Okay.
I'm having a hard time figuring out which way this pen goes.
That's one of the challenges with the pen tool. That's why it's always good to just keep getting in the habit of working with it and playing with it. One of the key things, of course, is to hold that Option key down when you click and drag in order to either change directions and that sort of thing. So I'm going to zoom out by hitting Command minus. And now we have Winnie the Pooh's shirt to draw in. And I'm going to do this behind Winnie's head, so that the background of his head can be preserved, and I can just draw some shapes in the background to get his shirt drawn in. And this time I'm going to use the actual brush tool, not the pen tool, in order to create that. I could certainly follow the same steps to sort of trace the collar and onto a sleeve and try to draw a fill object. But because my Winnie is not a complete illustration, right? I've only drawn, really we're focusing on his head. Anything that extends beyond the bottom here is going to be implied. Right? We're going to allude to that. And I'm going to use the paintbrush tool just to draw some shapes that allow me to sort of create this implied and continued elements back there. And in order to do that, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this one Shirt. So I'm clicking on my background layer just because it's my bottommost, but I'm going to click on the new layer button. I think it's going to be yellow, and I don't like the yellow. So I'm going to change a lot of parameters to this layer, and I'm not going to double click on the name, but I'm going to double click on this empty space next to the name, and by double clicking there it brings up the layers option dialog box, and this one I'm going to change the name to Shirt, and I'm going to change the color to the light red. I tend to go there whenever I have the option of changing that. So now I have this shirt layer, and I'm going to move this below my background layer. So I clicked on the layer itself and I'm dragging it down all the way to the bottom. And once I see that solid white line below my background layer, then I can let go. And indeed, Illustrator has moved my, my shirt layer down to the bottom. I'm even going to change this layer. Of course, you can always change afterwards. I'm going to change that to face. So it makes more sense. It's not quite the background anymore. Okay, any questions on that so far, that process? If you got some of you guys are still drawing those shapes to fill the mouth.
Yeah, how do you get it in back?
Copy, paste, and back, or cut, paste, and back is the technique that you'd want to use to get there. Okay. And Rostin, Tom, you guys doing all right back there? Any questions so far? Okay. How are you doing there, Robin? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So this time, as I mentioned, I'm going to use the paintbrush tool to draw that so I can get more control over the line work itself. And so we worked with the paintbrush tool a little bit on Thursday. I'm going to go ahead and double click on the paint. Whoops, that was a triple click, but it worked. I'm going to double click on the paintbrush tool to bring up the options that I'm going to be working with. And you see that by default, everything is okay with these settings. It's going to create, I didn't talk too much about these parameters. Lesson 11 will go into these a little bit, but you have a lot of options for the way your brush behaves when you're using it. So in other words, if you lift your pen and start drawing again, you can have your line stay selected by checking on this keep selected box. And that's what I'm going to click on here so that as I draw this entire shirt here, it's going to remain selected so that I continue to modify the objects as one. And I'll demonstrate that. Of course, I'll go ahead and click on the keep selected button, and I'll click on the OK button to set those parameters. And of course, you remember that last week we were working with our brushes. And so now that we have our paintbrush tool, we have a variety of options to choose from. And one of them is this, circular brush here. There's also this dot. I'm going to click on the circular brush and go ahead and start drawing by painting in the shape. Of course, I realized I was on the fill when I did that. Let me go ahead and undo that. I'll switch over, make sure that I'm on. There we go. We have a stroke. And of course, we're going to change the color to that same red that we used for the tongue. I think it's fine to stay within that same palette. So now I've clicked on the swatches panel to open that up, and I'll go ahead and click on red, and you can see now my my stroke is going to be red. I've got the paintbrush that I selected earlier, and because I'm on that layer in the background, I can start drawing, and nothing is happening. Why do you suppose that is? What's gone wrong here? Well, let me check my layer and make sure I'm on the right layer. And you can see that I indeed was on the wrong layer because I had changed the name of this background layer to face, and so I want to ensure that I'm on the shirt layer so that I can draw. Again, that caps lock key will bring up a precise cursor if you want to use a more precise tool for drawing, but for me that paintbrush tool is fine because I know that Illustrator draws from the very tip of that brush. So now I'm going to start filling this shape just drawing by hand with red, and you'll see here that it's taking a long time because that brush was very, very small. And unlike the blob brush tool where it draws shapes, and Christian, you had asked about this, right? The paintbrush tool, of course, draws lines. That's the big difference between those two. The blob brush tool is great for doing big puffy things like clouds or broad stroke shapes, but the paintbrush tool is what you want to use when you're actually creating line work that you're trying to get to look like an illustrated thing. So I realized that those lines that I was working with were not quite big enough. It would take me a long time to actually paintbrush in all of the red shirt area. So the beauty of this is, of course, you can undo that. I'm going to go ahead and undo those lines that I drew, and I'm going to open my brushes panel back up, and I'm going to double click this the circle that I select, because the circle is going to be fine for me, but I'm going to double click that so I can bring up these options and change the size of my brush. And it looks like 15 points was pretty small, so I'm going to bump it up around 50 points. It doesn't have to be exact. You can change the name to 50 points. And just call it a 50-point brush. And leaving it as circular is fine. Again, lesson 11, you're going to go into a little bit more about changing the angle and the roundness of a brush. But for this, I'm going to leave it at, I guess it turned out to be about 47, and that's fine. And now I can go in and draw more broad stroke and be a little bit more, getting fluid with this and allowing Illustrator to completely take advantage of these paintbrush tools. And you notice that effect along the bottom is what I wanted, right? I wanted the this implied illustrated effect to be what's left over. And you notice the preview that Illustrator gives me, it looks like it's drawing over my face layer, but it's not. It's actually drawing behind it. Once I let go, you can see that that's revealed. So this paintbrush tool is a totally different way. This could have easily have been done with the blob brush tool. Sometimes it's nice to leave those little white areas that are not filled. Kind of fun. But there we go. Now you can see Winnie the Pooh has a shirt that's been drawn with these sort of, the continuous the continuity of a shirt being implied. In fact, we haven't actually rendered it on the screen there. Okay. What I'd like to do is we're going to jump into a totally different phase of this. Any questions on that so far? This is just a lot of review today, you guys. I know I'm throwing a lot of different brushes at you, different techniques. Jumping back into the pen tool, working with layers. We're doing a lot of different stuff here. And so I want to make sure that you guys kind of are feeling pretty caught up. What do you guys think of this Winnie illustration? Is that looking pretty cool? All of you guys should have something pretty similar. I really like, keep eyeing Sean's over here. Sean got really fancy with his. If you get a chance to check out Sean's Winnie the Pooh, his shading is much more refined than what I showed you guys here. He used probably a bristle brush, or used the bristle brush on that. He used the bristle brush so he could get some texture in this shading, and then apply transparency effects to make it really subtle. So a lot of stuff you can do with these brushes. We're gonna get into a few more with the pattern and scatter brushes, but at this stage we've covered a bit. The lesson 11, again, for the homework assignment, that, by the way, it's a week and a half out. I know you guys have a design project going on right now, but not until next Thursday. Gosh, is that the 31st already?
Yeah.
Holy cow. Time's flying. Okay, so not until the following Thursday. So it's 29 pages. So it's going to be a pretty long lesson, but I guarantee when you're done with that lesson, you'll feel a lot more fluent with all of these brush tools, which are really powerful. Okay, why don't we go ahead and stop there, take a quick break. We can be back at, why don't we do 7:20? Is that going to be, is it about 8 minutes? I don't know, is that enough time? Okay, so 7 with the lesson here, and sort of work to add a little bit of a background to Winnie the Pooh. And I'm afraid, you guys, what I intend on doing with this background is not going to necessarily beautify this particular illustration. He kind of looks great all by himself here. But the purpose of this, of course, is I want to demonstrate a couple of the other brushes that Illustrator offers. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start by creating a background layer. So the same way we created the shirt layer earlier, I'm going to start by creating a new layer. And this time it's magenta colored, and that's fine. It'll allow me to see it well enough. I'll double click on the layers panel, the name box, so that I can change that. And let me go ahead and type in background in this case. We might have a couple of backgrounds, that's okay. And same thing as before, I'm going to take that background layer and I'm going to move it down to the bottom so that it's below my shirt layer. Keep in mind that I'm not hovering. You notice the difference here. If I hover over my shirt layer, you notice how that shirt layer turns a different shade of gray. If I were to let go of this layer while I'm hovering over my shirt layer, what happened is Illustrator actually dropped my background inside of that layer. That's not what I wanted. And so just keep that in mind. If you end up losing your layer, it's like, hey, my layer isn't at the top level. That can be what happens if you're not careful. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to close this shirt layer now that it's opened up, and I'm going to drag this so that that white line appears below that shirt layer. Okay, so now we're at this stage, and we're gonna start working on our background. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to draw a shape, just a rectangle in the background to start with. And right now I notice I have a red stroke on there and no fill, and that's okay for now because we're going to be doing a lot of changes. So all I'm doing is just you can size it whatever size you want, relatively rectangular shape. It's nice that it has the red line so I can indeed see where I'm going to be drawing. Okay. So now I've created that basic shape. What I want to do is create a border for my shape. That's what this whole process is about. But I'm going to create the border using Illustrator's pattern brush features. And you'll learn in Lesson 11 that there are several different types of brushes, right? We've already covered a few. There's calligraphic brushes. There are scatter brushes, right? Also bristle brushes, which we did a little bit on Tuesday or Thursday last week. And then there's also the pattern brushes, which we're about to use. I think that's all of them. Did I miss one, anyone? Sure. You can always cheat by looking at, if you notice here, I don't think I demonstrated this earlier, but I'm clicking on my brushes panel, and if I click on the menu button in the brushes panel here, you'll notice all of these, the art brushes is what I forgot. You'll notice that you probably all have the 5 brushes here selected. And the reason Illustrator gives you these options is if you want to narrow down, let's say you have a ton of brushes, you've done some custom stuff, or you've loaded brushes from the brushes library, you can always go back into this menu button and narrow down the brushes that are being shown by clicking on the appropriate button. So if you don't want your pattern brushes to show, you can deselect that option, and you notice I just had that little dashed line and it disappeared here. Keep in mind that this can also get you into trouble, right? And the reason I'm going over this is because Lesson 11 is going to cover some of this. And if you're not careful, you can hide one of your brushes by using this feature that I just showed you, and you'll be like, wait a minute, where are my pattern brushes? Well, if you're not showing them, they won't exist. So you go back in here and click on Show Pattern Brushes and make sure there's a check mark next to them, and you see this little pattern brush that has the sort of dotted line with scissors appears. Okay. Any questions on that menu button? Limiting the number of brushes that are shown here. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is start my own custom pattern, and I'm going to do something really simple just to kind of demonstrate. But basically, I'm going to create a circle, And in this case, I'm going to create kind of a perfect circle. I'm going to make sure I'm still on my background layer, and I am. And I'm going to create a perfect circle. It's not going to be that big. I'm going to hold the Shift key down, and let's see. It's probably going to be about a 1/4 inch size, maybe a 1/2 inch, or in this case it was 0.32 inches. But you see here I've created a circle that's pretty small. I can zoom in a little bit just to kind of help me see a little greater detail. And this circle still has the stroke red applied to it. I'm going to flip that. Anyone remember the keyboard shortcut to quickly flip those colors so that the fill is red instead of the stroke?
Shift X.
Shift X, exactly. Shift X will swap the colors of the stroke and fill on the object that I have selected. Okay, so now I have a red circle. I'm going to duplicate this and change the color by simply clicking on it with the selection tool. Notice I'm up here in the selection tool. And I'm going to click on my circle, and holding the Option key down, I'm going to drag away from there. And I'm just dragging down. The direction doesn't matter. What we're actually doing is creating our art for the pattern brush. We're not doing, we're not even going to preserve these elements after the fact. This is just so that we can create our artwork. But I've created a duplicate of that circle. I'm going to select that circle and change colors of it. So I'm going to go in here and change that one to an orange, just so that it's different and slightly different. Whoops, I applied that orange to my stroke. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to apply it to my fill. Now, we just went over the keyboard shortcut to swap the colors on a selected object. Does anyone know how I can swap the position? Anyone remember the keyboard shortcut for swapping the position of which one's at the foreground? Just X. That's right. Just X. If I just hit X, you notice it's not swapping the colors. It's just toggling which one is at the foreground. You see that? So that's a couple of great keyboard shortcuts to really get you working a little faster when you're colorizing your object. So I'm going to bring that fill color to the foreground by simply hitting X, and then going over to my orange. I'm going to pick the lighter orange, so there's some contrast there. And I'm going to apply orange to that fill, to the fill of that object.
So what did you do?
I simply filled this object with an orange. And the reason I picked these colors is because they complement our design. That's the only reason. They could be anything. You could make it a more creative color palette and get really wild with it if you'd like. You can even do a square shape. There's, I did circles so that you can kind of see some spacing in between them and stuff, and it's a pretty quick way to go. So this is what we have now. So in order to create a pattern brush out of these objects actually need to be turned into something. Okay? You remember a while back we needed to turn our patterns into symbols in order to create the patterns that you guys worked on a couple weeks ago. This time, in order to create the pattern brush effects, these aren't going to be symbols, but they're actually going to be swatches themselves. We haven't really messed around with this yet. But if you notice, I can take this, I'm going to take the red one first, I can take that and drag it right into my swatches panel. And by the way, it's important that your swatches panel is open. And you notice I have mine open in an extended way. And notice that when I drag into my swatches panel, the green plus sign appears, and you know, can you guys tell where that swatch is going to land when I let go? Right by the other patterns there. You see that dark blue thick line that appears there. If I let go, you notice my little red circle is now a swatch element that I can use to paint with. It's actually, just like stroking a color with, or stroking an object with a color, I can stroke an object with that shape that I created. So it sort of works like symbols, kind of like symbol-ish. If you guys remember symbols from the week prior.
Yeah,
What's that?
It's like Japan.
Like a what?
Japan.
Oh yeah, it looks like the Japanese flag. I think, Tom, that was your design there for project 2. That was had the Japanese influence. So I now have my red circle as a swatch item, a swatch element. I'm going to do the same thing with my orange circle. I'm going to click on it, drag it over into my swatches panel, and now I have 2 objects that I can use to create a pattern brush.
So theoretically, you could actually paint Pooh's head, the whole thing we've made of Pooh, as a swatch.
As a swatch,
if you really wanted.
if you wanted to. You know, and then you could draw a line, and then you'd have a bunch of Winnie the Pooh heads like, along the line is what would happen with this. But we're going to do something slightly different to create a pattern from these, you know, because we have 2 different shapes, and you'll see that next. So now we have our swatches panel open. What we want to do is switch over to our brushes panel. So go ahead and click on your brushes button to open that up, and we're back to where we were before. You guys got it? Okay. And just like most other panels, when you want to create a new object, you have the Create New layer or button down here at the bottom of that panel. So we're going to click on that Create New Brush option, and you notice that there are different brushes that are available to us. Now, why do you suppose that Scatter Brush and Art Brush are dimmed out? We can't do anything with those.
Mine aren't good.
Yours aren't dimmed? Anyone else?
Mine
Not.
are too.
Yours are not dimmed?
Yeah, they're still there.
Who else is not dimmed? Okay, there's a reason for that. And basically, you notice my 2 objects over here are not selected.
Oh, I have one selected.
And if you have one selected, these options are there for you because you can create the scatter and art brushes dynamically from the objects that you select. Okay? These other brushes, however, work slightly differently, and the pattern brush relies on symbols that you or objects that you've created as swatches. And so that's why, anyway, just a heads up on why those aren't available for me, and they probably might be for you, and that's because I don't have any objects selected. All right, but that's okay. I'm going to create a pattern brush by clicking on the pattern brush option here, making sure that the radio button appears. There it is. Click on OK, and the pattern brush option dialog box appears. I'm going to change the name of this to Borders, all lowercase. The book likes to use uppercase, and as a matter of fact, some people might get annoyed by the uppercase or by the lowercase thing if you're working with others. But again, the reason I choose, and what you guys want to do in your own, your own world is fine for outside of this class. But again, the reason I choose all lowercase and I try to avoid spaces and names for things, again, it's that working towards a web-friendly world. Because Illustrator, Photoshop, all of these applications are getting better and better at creating designs for World of Web, for mobile applications, for this digital world that we live in. You can design a whole website within Illustrator. As a matter of fact, Illustrator CC, the newest, the latest version, will completely export all of your HTML and CSS based on your designs right out of Illustrator. So the world is getting more web savvy, and so that's why I choose to choose file naming that works in that world, so that if you're exporting layers, you're exporting artboards and things into a web environment, your naming convention will always be will be more compatible with that. Anyway, just a reminder on that and why we stick to it, at least here in this class. So we've brought up the dialog box for the pattern brush options, and you notice there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? Well, this right here is what these icons are. What define our pattern. I realize I missed a step here, guys, so bear with me for a second. It's okay. I'm going to cancel out of this. It's not going to be much work to repeat it. and I'm going to go back to my swatches panel, and I'm actually going to name these swatches. And you can do that simply by double-clicking on them. And when you double-click on the and this is actually an important step, not just for the naming, but for the copies themselves. You remember here, this is back where we created our patterns earlier, a couple weeks ago, and this dialog box should look a little bit familiar. And you notice here's the 5 copies, and it's created a pattern that's 5 copies wide, 5 copies deep. We're not going to do that for this particular swatch. We're going to change this to a the name of red dot. And again, I'm not using spaces. I'm using a dash in there, and that's okay. And I'm going to switch the copies that are being created by this pattern to 1 by 1. So it's just going to be a single dot that gets rendered wherever we use this pattern. Once you've set those parameters, and that is basically changing the name and setting the copies to 1 by 1, you apply this. This works a little differently than other dialog boxes, right? Normally we see a little finish or done button down at the bottom of the dialog box, but it doesn't work like that here with the pattern options. It appears up here in this gray line above our artboard, and what you do is simply hit done when you're ready to apply that change. I'm going to do the same thing with the orange dot. Double click on it to bring up the pattern dialog box, and I'm going to change this to orange dot with a dash in between, and I'm going to go down here and change my copies to 1 by 1. Then I'll click on the done button to apply that, and now if I hover over those swatches, you'll see the appropriate name appears. Any questions on that so far? Pretty straightforward stuff. All right. So now I'm going to go back over to my brushes panel. I'm going to open that up. You can go ahead and open that up and click on that new brush button to bring up that dialog box. Click on pattern brush and OK to bring up the options. Okay, now when I look at my options here, and I'm going to again apply the name border, you see that my red dot and orange dot appear here as a couple of options that can be applied to, or can be used to create my pattern. And if you notice here, this tile is the first one, and this little illustration here shows you where the particular swatch is going to be applied. And in this case, it's the side tile. And when I hover over the icon itself, you'll see that the side tile text appears to remind me what is being applied there. And basically, whenever I go to apply this pattern to a shape, the side tile is going to be whichever of these swatches I use. So in this case, I want my side tile to be orange, so I'm going to, or the orange dot. So I'm going to click on the orange dot, and that side tile of the orange dot is going to be applied to the side. And here's the corner tile, and you can see that by the illustration, right? And I think this is the outer corner tile. Yeah, outer corner tile is what's going to be applied if there's an outer corner to my shape. And I'm going to click over onto that button, and I'm going to apply my red dot onto the outer corner. Now, because I'm working with just a simple rectangle, I don't need to worry about my inner corner tile, my end tile or start tile. Those are all going to be, I'm going to leave blank, and that's perfectly okay to do. One other option or change that I want to make here is I'm going to add space to fit, not stretch to fit. And the reason for that is stretch to fit will actually take my dots and stretch them and squish them or condense them out if they don't fit nicely along my path. So if you go to use this pattern making tool and you start to see distortion in your shapes, go back to this options box, and of course you'll know how to do that, right? Once you've created your pattern, you can simply double click on the pattern to change these parameters, and we'll do that in a second. But add space to fit is the one you want to do if you want to preserve the integrity of your shape. So earlier, when you said we could create a Winnie the Pooh pattern, certainly could, but if we left stretch to fit as an option, it could kind of distort that sketch along the path. So I'm going to, in this case, select add space to fit in order to preserve the circles, because I want those things to stay circles. So now I click on OK to create my pattern. So you see Illustrator by default gave me this little dashed line, which is kind of cool, but now I've actually created my own pattern brush, and it's shown here in the brushes panel. Okay, so to apply that, I simply select that rectangle that I had drawn earlier by selecting it, and in this case I've clicked, I used the marquee tool to draw across using the direct selection tool, or not the direct selection tool, but the selection tool, and I can click over here on my pattern, and you'll see Illustrator has now applied that pattern I created to that shape. It's over the red stroke on that. It's been overridden by this border. As a matter of fact, I might want to turn off that stroke and make it none, so that, well, when you do, so here's the trick. When you do that, it actually, because I hit none, it completely erased even the brush that was applied. So you have to have some sort of stroke applied for these brushes to work, is one little detail I'd kind of forgotten about. That's okay. I got rid of it. I can always add it again by clicking on that, and it'll apply a color to that stroke. But the pattern is actually overriding that. And you notice I ended up with really nice even circles, not squished circles, and that was because of the options that I made, or that I chose in that dialog box. Okay, any questions on that so far? Tom?
Yeah, I've got an error that says patterns cannot contain masked objects.
Masked objects. There are limitations to the pattern itself. Did you guys create anything other than a circle? Maybe quickly switch over to outline mode and see if you had a more complex shape. You created a 3D shape. So that's probably what caused it for you. The 3D what's that? The 3D shape was something too complex for Illustrator to be able to use as a pattern brush element. Anyone else have issues with that? I know I see yours, Cynthia. We'll get over to you in a second. It's kind of important stuff you guys all got. Is that good? Something new for everyone, or have you guys worked with pattern brushes? Creating these? Yeah, so now you, and keep in mind, well, you'll have a video that you'll always be able to refer to if you want to apply this to a project and want to remember how to do it. So go ahead and hit OK. Interesting. Patterns can be created with anything painted with a gradient fill or a pattern. So let's just kind of start over. And this is just the shape. Let's look at the attributes. Just the fill, no stroke. That's fine. And this is the same. Fill, no stroke. So I'm going to go back into the swatches, and I'm going to delete these just in case. I'm going to click away, and I'm going to delete these in case something unusual happens. Okay. And then we're going to drag these right back in there. And then I'm going to name this one. Go ahead and do that red dot. And then just go ahead and then make sure it's one by one, Cynthia. It's important that you get this because I want to make sure you guys know about this pattern brush feature and what you can do with it. And so now, we've got this nice border. So you can see now that was a swatch that we created from these dots, we can indeed just get rid of those shapes, and our design, the pattern is preserved because we turned those shapes into swatches. Yeah, be sure it's one by one too, or else yeah, there you go. And of course, Sean's going the extra mile. He's got some wavy frame going on there with the dots. I mean, you can apply this to any object that has a stroke on it. If you can apply a stroke to it, you can apply pattern brushes to it. And again, for more granular use of this and creating, and actually there's some cool stuff in Lesson 7, by the way, in terms of, boy, splitting, positioning the splits between pattern. Did it still do it?
Well, it has a pattern inside the circle.
Oh, so
Why don't you just try it, start over with the circle?
yeah, I would draw. Let's draw new circles. Well, and we still have a pattern inside. Let's see. Oh, yeah. See, these are. Yeah, there is a pattern inside of those. What layer?
Oh, that's cool.
So let's. Swatches well, nevertheless, it's actually it should still work. So if we go to brush, so if we go in here, go to pattern brush, and then go in order, decide it's red. Yeah. Add space to fill.
Is that bird? You obviously have
I think I got a heart in there.
well, yeah, they're probably close.
Oh, I'm getting the red.
Yeah, well, they're not really like a true diner, but they do still.
Just what I-
Bear with me a sec, you guys. I want to make sure that Cynthia's, that we work through these kind of technical issues. There. Now, what it is here's what had happened. The last object you had selected was you had accidentally filled with your swatch. And so it was remembering that you had filled with that swatch or dot, and you were trying to reapply it to a new pattern. So now we can start from scratch and you know, create the dots on it.
When I did it, I got the red dot too.
And now we've got two clean objects. This goes like this too.
Just one dot.
Now
So you have three on the.
I had hair.
I was on the right.
now nothing is selected. Try that process again. Let's see if we can get that one to work. I think you had accidentally applied the swatch to your original dots, and then you were trying to, you know, something happened there. Anyway, hopefully this fixes it. All right. Any other questions on that so far? Okay. Now keep in mind that with this shape, I'm going to switch over to fill, and I'm going to click on a color. And notice that when I go to, there we go, it's got to be selected. When I go to fill this shape with a color, I've toggled over to the fill side, and I simply did that by hitting X. You can still continue, even though you can't really change the stroke color itself because we've applied a pattern brush, you can still apply fills to your to the object that you've selected. And you know, in this case, I'll just do a real light gray just to give it a bit of, that was actually, yeah, I think that's 5% gray. So it's really subtle, a real subtle gray back there. So you can see that you can still apply fills even though the stroke can't be manipulated because the pattern brush is overriding it. Okay. All right. Any questions there? Are we good? All right. So the next thing I want to do is show you guys quickly about a scatter brush. Who remembers the scatter brush? Anyone remember the scatter brush? Did we do scatter brush at all?
You talked about it,
Okay,
but we'll We didn't do a lesson on it, but you said you did one of the early projects, the one with stars.
Oh,
on it. You
okay.
said you used it.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Well, today we're going to actually we're going to create scatter brushes, and scatter brushes are really neat because they allow you to create randomized sort of effects. So yeah, I remember what you're talking about now, Christian. I don't know if you guys remember, but that first design project that I had when we first, or the welcome screen that I created had a big star field, and all I did was created a scatter brush with white dots, and then just drew a bunch of squiggly lines and randomized the scatter, and we're going to do that in a second so this all makes sense to you. And so I ended up with this star field that looked pretty random. So how did we do that? Well, I'll go ahead and start that demonstration by, again, creating a new layer, just so I can start anew. I've opened up my layers panel. I clicked on background, and of course background I want to stay background. That's nice. I can just click on new layer. Cyan is okay color. I'm going to change the name to Bugs. Not Bugs Bunny. You'll see what I mean by that in a second. Now I'm going to lock my background layer, the shirt layer, and the details layer so that I don't mess around with any of the artwork that's on those layers. And by the way, there's another shortcut way to get a quicker, more isolated way to lock other layers and keep your layer, the one you want to work on, unlocked. I don't know if I've demonstrated this before. Maybe one of the lessons covered this feature, but this can be really handy. Excuse me. And sometimes your artwork might get very complex, right, with lots of layers. I mean, I've built Illustrator files with hundreds of layers, and especially when you're doing map graphics or that type of thing, you get really you can get a lot of layers going. And so, if you hold down the Option key while you click on the toggle lock area, you'll notice the first thing that happens is everything unlocks. And if I do it again, everything else locks. So that's a keyboard kind of keyboard shortcut to quickly lock and unlock all the other layers that you don't want to work on. So in this case, I had a bunch of random ones unlocked and some locked. Well, I kind of want to get to a state where everything is locked except the one I want to work on. So I'll just click twice, holding the Option key down, and that kind of is a keyboard shortcut to do that for me. Okay, could be pretty handy as your projects get more elaborate with layers. Okay, so now I've got everything locked except for my bugs layer, and I want to create a scatter brush. The cool thing about scatter brushes, unlike the pattern brush that you guys saw, is not happy when you try to create either 3D objects, and Cynthia, I see you got that working, so that's good. There's definitely some stuff that you can't do with pattern brushes, but here I'm going to use a symbol to create a scatter brush. So the first thing I want to do is open up my symbols palette, and you'll see that none of these I really want to do. What I want to create is I want to create some bees buzzing around Winnie the Pooh's head. And the Illustrator by default has a library. If you open up your symbols panel, then click on the library button in the bottom left corner, you can move down to nature, and once that swatches panel opens up, you'll see that in here I have a bee kind of, actually it's a yellow jacket, it's not a bee, but for now it's going to work. It's pretty close. Oh, they actually call it a bee. Maybe it is a bee. All right, that's cool. I thought it was a yellow jacket, but it is. Oh, so they're politically incorrect. Totally different species. I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe they are. But anyway, so there's this bee. There's this bee symbol in here, and you can actually create a scatter brush out of this using some of the similar techniques. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to drag the bee onto my desktop, or onto my artboard, excuse me, and now I have that symbol has been activated and available for me to use as a scatter brush. So That bee's probably around about the right size to start with, and that's cool. So we can kind of go from there. If you guys have a, you know, what would it be, bee phobia or something? I'm sorry, you can use a flower or a different object if this is going to creep you out. I know some people have arachnophobia. If you try doing this with a spider, it might really give you the willies. But nevertheless, you know, the creativity is yours here. I'm going to, you know, select my bee symbol now that it's on my artboard, and I'm going to go back into my brushes panel and again click on this new brushes option here. And you notice, like you guys, some of you guys had previously when you had selected artwork, the scatter brush and art brush are available to me here on the dialog box that appears. So I'll click on scatter brush and then click on OK. And this is where things can get pretty cool with this scatter brush. For now, I'm just going to name this scatter brush bees and then click on OK. And you know, it gave me a, you're right, Robin, this is indeed a yellow jacket. It's not a bee. And you see it gives me a preview here, and there's some cool stuff that I might be able to do once I get this created. So I can't preview this yet because it's not being applied. I just click on OK, and it's created a new pattern brush here. It doesn't look like anything yet because I haven't applied it to anything. And so I can move this bee out of the way. And watch what I'm going to do here. I'm confirming that I'm still in my bugs layer because that's the one I want to be drawing in, and I'm certainly there. I'm going to go over to my paintbrush option here, and I'm going to change the fill to none. Notice my paintbrush is selected, and I'm going to switch the fill to none, and it's okay if I draw a red line. And I'm just going to make a random line here. I'm just going to kind of draw something, and notice that because that brush was selected within my panel over here, see how it's selected? You can see that little line. It was selected from when I made it. You can see that some bees have been created here with this dialog box. But that doesn't look very natural, right? It's pretty, you know, obviously this is kind of what we were talking about earlier with that pattern brush. If you could do Winnie the Pooh's head multiple times, but this doesn't look very random. I certainly want this to be a little more randomized. And what's neat about this is I can go back into the brush after I've created it by opening my brushes panel. And you'll see here's my bees brush that I custom created using a symbol. I can double click on it now to open up that dialog box again. And notice this time, because it's being applied to an existing object, the preview button appears down here. And now when I go to make any of these changes to the behavior of this scatter brush, I can actually see them happening on screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the size from fixed to random. And you notice when I do that, there are the second slider becomes active, and that's because the left slider adjusts one, you know, the smallest or the largest that your randomization will appear in terms of size, and the other one adjusts the other parameter as well. So I'm going to take this one, the first one, and I'm just going to slide it to the left a little bit, say around 90% smaller than my original size. And I'm going to take the other one and slide it upwards to say around 105, 110. Whoa, somewhere in there. It's real granular. There we go, 113 is fine. And you can't see a lot of difference here, but at least on my screen I can already see I have this 113% larger bee and this smaller one over here. So that's starting to randomize it a little bit. But I'm going to even push this further by going to spacing and do a random, actually no, I don't want spacing to be randomized. I'm going to leave it at fixed for now, but I am going to increase it some by bumping this up, and you can see 100 and 200-ish. you know, it looks like I've got a lot of spacing between these bees, and that's okay. I might even push it a little more. Obviously, that's going to be less bees per line, but that's okay. I want these things kind of flying around Winnie's head, so I'll leave it at around 275. That's fine. Then scatter is where we can start positioning or changing the position of where these bees end up. So I've changed the scatter option to random, and I'm going to slide the left one down a little bit. Negative, boy, we can push that quite a bit. Negative 144. It's just a random number, and I can slide the one on the right up towards maybe that same amount. You know, 100. You know, I'm getting a couple of hundred. But you know, the nice thing about this preview thing is that you can really see the changes that are being applied as you do this to your actual lines. I realize my spacing might be too much with these large randomization figures, but you can see now I'm starting to get, you know, I've got this one is right on the line, this one's underneath it, this one's slightly above. Illustrator's working hard to scatter these around, and you know, you can just basically apply whatever options you want to this. Now, my final adjustment is going to be the rotation. I'm going to click on the rotation feature itself, and then click on randomize there, and I'm going to take that leftmost slider and change the angle, you know, in some negative fashion there. I'm probably going to push those quite a bit. And then on the right one, I'm going to push to the right of center to randomize these even more in the opposite direction. And so now you can kind of see that I'm getting bees that are actually a little more of what I really want to see. Now, if you click on the OK button, you'll see this dialog box that appears. This is important. I want to demonstrate this. So once you're happy with how random your bees are looking, go ahead and click on the OK button in the dialog box and leave this dialog box up on the screen. And I'll explain what that is. Anyone
Already clicked OK.
you already clicked OK and then you're back on it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. So basically, all this is doing is if I leave strokes here, if I click on leave strokes, what's going to happen is this line that I have selected in the background is going to receive the pattern that I just created, or the scatter that I just created. Okay, but a new pattern will be created in my dialog box. I mean, in my my brushes panel. A new one with these adjustments is going to be created, and it's going to leave my original. Do you guys remember the original that I created was just all of the bees lined up in a row? The original will be preserved. If I click on Apply to Strokes, it's going to override what I previously had set for this specific swatch. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Apply to Stroke because there's no way I would want to use that original one. And you see now by clicking on Apply, I still have my single bees swatch here, and it didn't create a duplicate of that. That's the only difference there. I just want to demonstrate that and what that dialog box means, because sometimes when we receive dialog boxes in Illustrator or any program for that matter, you automatically think, oh, there's a problem, right? It's an issue. Something's broken. That's not always the case. I mean, it is most of the time, but a lot of times it's just especially in Illustrator, is just another feature that's being presented, or options that are being presented to you. I'm going to delete my original symbol, and it's okay because I've created this pattern brush from that symbol, and Illustrator no longer needs it. I kind of like the way that looks, you know. I mean, just like that. I could go as far as moving the bugs layer above Winnie the Pooh, or all the way to the top, actually, right? And that would that would give me a, oh, it's hard to get right there, especially with this pen tool. That would put the bugs on top of his head. And that's a little too much, but you can see some of the randomization that was happening in the background there. So anyway, that was just a quick demonstration on several brushes that are available to you to use for your projects in Illustrator. Any questions on that so far? No? Okay. This next technique I want to show you isn't related to, yeah, we're doing plenty of time, isn't related to the brushes themselves, so you won't find any information on this in the lesson itself, lesson 11. But it's a technique, and I try to throw these in whenever possible to maybe give you just other ideas. There's thousands and thousands of techniques that you can use for your designs, but a lot of times, what's really nice in Illustrator, right, or any any illustration, is to create subtle textures to your artwork. Now, what does that mean? I realize to me, I think I've thrown terminology like that out to you guys before, and you guys have questioned, well, what's subtle texture mean? Well, a subtle texture is simply just that, right? It's a texture that's very subtle. It's almost hardly there. You know, it's something that it's almost indistinguishable, but it can give enough of an effect to your illustrations that it almost makes it look like it's either been rendered on a canvas or it's actually been done and drawn and illustrated by hand. And those are always things that can enhance an illustration. I think if you guys can look over at Sean's, I'm still digging Sean's, the shading that he did on Winnie's head. You can see that the shading, that's a great example of subtle texture, right? It's just slightly there, but it's there enough to make it feel like it was actually drawn with a watercolor brush as opposed to being rendered in Illustrator. So pretty cool stuff that you can do. But this particular texture is going to be slightly different. I'm going to create something that just applies an overall texture to my entire drawing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my lines layer because I want my texture to be on top of my entire illustration. Okay? So if anyone ever wants to get to that same stage where we're ready to create a new layer, certainly can. And I'm going to click on the new layer button to create a new layer at the very topmost, and I'm going to call this layer texture. That's what I'm going to do there. Okay, and you guys are going to be baffled by what I'm about to do. I'm going to create a rectangle. So I've switched over to my shape, I'm using my rectangle tool to create that, and I'm just going to draw a rectangle all the way across my entire illustration. All right, so because I had a red line or a red stroke applied to the shape, I've simply, that's what I have. If I click away from it, and there's a couple of different, I think I've been primarily showing you guys the method of clicking away using the selection tool to deselect objects, but keep in mind you can always go to Object, is it Object or Edit? Where is that? See, I don't even know. Did you guys see where, oh no, I'm sorry, Select. Sorry. So if I want to deselect stuff, I can select and then choose deselect, and that's another method that works perfectly fine for selecting or deselecting objects. And as a matter of fact, that same feature, if I click on select and go to all, Command A is the keyboard shortcut, it'll click, it'll select everything that's available. Now, why aren't the rest of my lines selected? There's a lot of artwork I have here. Well, obviously, they didn't get selected because those layers are locked, and that's perfectly fine. I'll also show you, while we're here, I'll demonstrate that even though my bugs are selected, if I were to lock this layer while they're selected, they just aren't selected anymore. So you can still modify and lock layers after the fact there. Okay, so I've drawn this rectangle, and I am going to apply a gradient to this entire selection by clicking on the gradient panel, and I'm just making sure that my fill button is at the foreground. I'm going to click right on the gradient to apply that to it. And so you're wondering to yourself, why would you take this great illustration and suddenly cover it up with this big gradient so you can't see anything? Well, we're going to modify this. Obviously, you guys can probably already suspect that we're going to apply a transparency effect to it. But before we do that, I'm going to select that shape, and it's hard to see here, you guys, because of course I was lazy and I didn't change the color of my layer from gray to something that stands out a little more. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to go light red. And now you can kind of see that indeed this shape is selected because the red line is showing up as my bounding box. Okay, so with this object selected, is everyone there with that gradient shape selected? Anyone not there? And you've got a radial, that's great. You can do whatever you want with this. But we have a gradient. And if you go back up to the effect, you guys remember we worked with live effects, which are these upper above the line. And down underneath, there are Photoshop effects that you can also use. Well, under the texture option is this cool feature called grain. So if you select grain from the texture option, it'll bring up the entire effects. I forget what you call this feature set that appears when it opens up. You can still access all of the other Photoshop effects once that opens up. They're all still here, but by default, the grain one has appeared as the default because that's what I selected. So in order to make some changes here, I'm going to change the grain type to sprinkles. And you notice by doing that, I'm going to reduce the intensity a little bit, change that to 30. Let's see how much that changes that. And now you'll see that the sprinkles effect has sort of followed the contour of my gradient slightly. I'm zooming out within this dialog box, by the way, by clicking on the command minus so I can see more of my artwork. And you see when I applied sprinkles, the gradient has gone from virtually undetectable here in the wider areas of my gradient to more detectable here in the darker areas of my gradient. And that's indeed what I want. I'm using the hand, which is the default, to move around my artwork here. I like what I see here at 30 intensity with sprinkles, so I'm going to go ahead and just click on OK there, and it's going to apply the grain. As soon as it does this, I'm going to hit Save. I'm just going to Command S this puppy real quick, and I suggest that you all do the same here. Click on Command S, and boy, the save happened before the filter actually started to apply here. I'm going to do a save after this filter too, now that we're using such a big, your artwork might start to move pretty slowly just because of the size of this giant, this is almost a 20 by 20 inch box, and we've applied this Photoshop filter. So I'm going to go to File, Save. Command S gives you the same thing, so we'll wait for that to save for a moment. And then, the next step is pretty straightforward. I am simply going to go to my transparency panel once that's done saving, and I am going to click on, well, that's a big file now. We'll give that a few moments to finish. And the reason I'm saving, I should have been saving all along, but I definitely recommend you save here because as artwork gets more complex, on these slower computers, you might end up with Photoshop really hanging on this on some of the features here. So I'll let this finish saving, and then as I mentioned before, we're going to go to the transparency panel, and of course multiply is what I want to do here. It's going to knock out all of the white and preserve the darker areas so that now a slight and subtle gradient or texture has been applied to my artwork. So we'll let that finish up. It's taking a while. Boy, this is a slow process on such a big illustration. But I wanted to show you guys this just as a real subtle, or in this case, not so subtle way of applying texture. Keep in mind, this is still a gradient here, you guys. I can still change it. If this is too dark, I can change the value of the black to something lighter. Again, the key is subtlety here. So if I go back into my gradient panel, you'll see I still have my object selected. Black is the darkest color. I'm going to click on the slider, or double click on it, I should say, to bring up the dialog box. Boy, it's slow going, this process. This is what I should have been doing on a faster computer to really demonstrate this process. But nevertheless, I can double click on this slider to bring up the dialog box and apply a much lighter gray to it, maybe even a 10% or a 20% gray. And by doing that, it'll make that texture a lot more subtle. And so, of course, unfortunately, that double clicking, by the way, with the mouse can be a bear sometimes. So this is, with the pen tool. So this is where having a mouse is really helpful. I'm going to double click on it again. There, now it brings it up, and I can change this to 20. When I hit return after typing in 20, it's going to take a while for this to process again. But you guys get the idea, you get the gist. That grain feature is kind of a neat way to add one of many subtle texture techniques that you can apply to your designs. Okay.
Mine brought up the swatches panel.
Yeah, you can toggle, remember? Toggle back and forth. On the left side of that panel is right there. There you go. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. You can switch over to the swatches or the color panel right within that little panel that appears when you double click on the gradient. So, nevertheless, here it is. It's harder to detect now because I have a 20% gray on top of a gray background, but I think that was probably enough to give you guys an idea of what's really going on. And believe it or not, that texture is still there. It should be there. Did I not have that object selected when I made that change? I don't know why I can't see it anymore. Another nice feature of that Illustrator is whenever you apply any of these effects, we might have covered this previously, but whenever you apply any of these effects, you can always go back and apply that last effect. You can apply the last effect that you use to any future objects by simply clicking on the Effect drop-down menu, and you notice here Apply Grain is at the top. And that Illustrator's done that so that you don't have, especially if you're getting fancy with some of your filters, you don't have to go back and redo that same filter every time. Illustrator's conveniently giving you the keyboard command, Command-Shift-E up there on the screen so that you can apply that same technique to previously drawn or to newly drawn objects.
Hey Caesar?
Yeah.
How come when you scrolled over Effect and Video it said de-interlace?
De-interlace?
Like, is there de-interlace projects in Illustrator?
You know, I've seen that before. I've never used that in either Illustrator or Photoshop. It exists in Photoshop. I imagine that within Illustrator, maybe you could bring it would have to be a still image, right? You can't really import movies into Illustrator, but you could bring a still image that maybe. Do you guys know what interlacing is?
Roughly.
So within, I can draw it on screen. So it's kind of, you guys might not be getting into too much video and stuff in the near future, but it also applies to things like PNG files, other web formats. But basically what happens is, and it also applies to your television, especially if you have an older television. You guys have probably all heard of in TV land the 1080p, right, versus 1080i or 480i. You might have heard that terminology, not really understood what that means. Well, basically what happens is on your screen at any given time, there's an image, right? And there's two techniques that Illustrator uses, or I'm sorry, that video uses to draw it. It either draws interlaced, which is one line at a time this way, here, and it keeps going. And then in the next frame, it draws the alternate missing lines here to create the image. And so basically what happens is in interlacing, it takes 2 frames to create one image. Well, the 1080p that we know about in video is, and it takes a much faster television, a more faster processor, or more faster media equipment, whether you're working with cameras, your mobile devices, like the iPhone has 1080p capabilities. What happens is, in 1080p, the images actually all drawn consecutively at the same time. All of the lines are drawn in a single frame. So it's just, you get a much smoother, faster picture and that sort of thing. So, I'm sorry to belabor this, but to answer the question, what happens is, I've seen this in images where you can end up with frames that have that interlacing effect because you maybe got one frame out of a video still. Well, this filter, at least in Photoshop, should theoretically be able to take that and combine 2 separate images so that that they're laced on top of each other correctly. Anyway, so whether that works, that's in theory. How it works specifically, I don't know. I just thought I'd take the opportunity to brag a little bit about my knowledge of interlacing. But the reason it's relevant, you guys, is because when you go to save, if you guys get into web design and you go to save PNG files for web graphics, you do have an option as to whether those PNGs are interlaced or not, or progressive, basically. And you always want progressive. All modern-day computers are capable of drawing a progressive graphic, which does take a little more horsepower, but in this day and age, you'll be fine. Okay. Anyway, that's today's lesson in a nutshell. We're finishing up a little bit early in terms of the lesson itself.